The sound arrives before the aircraft, not the jet shriek of a Phantom, not the rhythmic chop of a Huey. Something older, something that belongs to another war, another decade, another century of flight. Twin radial engines, the same low throb that carried paratroopers to Normandy 20 years ago, droning above the Mekong Delta on a night in late December 1964. When the darkness is trying to swallow an outpost whole. Then a noise that nobody on the ground has ever encountered. Not individual gunshots, not a burst from an automatic weapon, a continuous roar, a buzzsaw shredding the jungle canopy from 3,000 feet above. Every fifth round glows red. Tracers falling from the orbiting aircraft like a river of flame curving through the dark. The stream bends as the plane banks. It connects sky to earth in one unbroken arc of crimson light. And that glowing river, that visible torrent of fire, represents only 20% of what is actually descending. The other 80% is invisible. For every tracer you can see, 4 bullets you cannot see are falling beside it. Sergeant Dale Kowalski is pressing his face into the dirt behind a sandbag wall. He is 22 years old. Polish kid from Hamtramck, Michigan, zip code 4-82123 blocks from St. Florian Church, where his mother lights candles for him every Sunday. His father, Kazimierz Kowalski, ran a spot welder on the Ford line at River Rouge for 22 years. His hands were burned so many times the skin on his palms was smooth and shiny, like the bottom of a pot that has been scrubbed too often. Dale enlisted in 1963 because the plant was not hiring, and his old man told him the Army would teach him something the Union could not. Tonight, at a forward outpost somewhere in the Mekong Delta, the perimeter wire has been breached on the south side. The ammunition is dwindling. The radio operator, a kid from Akron who everyone calls Sparky, has been screaming for air support for 40 minutes. His voice cracking on the tactical frequency, repeating their grid coordinates to anyone listening, begging for Spooky for Puff for anything with guns. Nobody is coming. The fast jets went home 2 hours ago. The flare ship dropped its last flare 20 minutes ago and banked west toward its base, leaving them in darkness. There is nothing between Kowalski and the assault force except the night and whatever is left in his magazine. He has 3 magazines. 2 are empty. The third is loaded with 18 rounds. He does the math every infantryman does when the math starts going wrong. Then the engines, then the roar, then the Red River. The jungle floor detonates. Trees shatter at the base. The assault freezes. Every Viet Cong soldier within 300 meters of that red stream is either dead wounded or running. The muzzle flashes that had been creeping toward the wire vanish. The night goes silent except for the drone of those radial engines circling patient watchful. The attack is over. Kowalski lies behind his sandbag wall with his face in the dirt and his hands shaking and his last magazine still full because he never had to fire it. The dragon came. The enemy had a word for what circled above them. They called it the dragon, but the dragon was not born in a laboratory or designed in a Pentagon war room. It was born in a filing cabinet, in a forgotten report, in an idea that the United States military rejected 3 separate times across 4 decades before one man pulled it out of the drawer, dusted it off, and paid for the ammunition tests with his personal credit card. This is the story of that man, of that idea, and of what happened when a cargo plane designed in the 1930s became the most feared weapon of the Vietnam War. It is also the story of the 23-year-old loadmaster who threw himself onto a burning magnesium flare inside an aircraft filled with thousands of rounds of live ammunition, and why the Air Force named its highest enlisted honor after him. But before any of that, before the dragon breathed fire, before the medal and the memorial, and the sound that would make veterans stop in their tracks at air shows 40 years later, there was a problem. A simple, brutal, unsolved problem that was killing Americans every night. The Viet Cong owned the darkness. And in 1964, the United States Air Force had nothing that could take it back. Vietnam was a war fought after dark. The Viet Cong traveled in darkness, assembled in darkness, struck in darkness, and dissolved back into it, before American air power could answer. Isolated special forces camps, scattered hamlets, outposts, hacked from hostile jungle and ringed with concertina wire. Every one of them became exposed once the sun dropped. American air power in 1964 was designed for daylight. Fast jets built for another kind of war. The F-100 Super Sabre and the A-1 Sky Raider could deliver devastating ordnance, but they could not linger. One pass over the target, maybe two, and fuel drove them home. The guerrillas figured this out fast. Wait out the jet. Let the noise fade. Pick up the attack. The Air Force tried to solve the darkness with light. C-47 transport aircraft, the same Douglas workhorses that had hauled cargo over the hump into China and dropped paratroopers across occupied Europe, were packed with Mark 24 magnesium illumination flares and sent to orbit above besieged positions. They called them flare ships. The C-47 would circle at 3,000 feet, releasing parachute flares that burned at 2 million candle power, each turning night into noon. The defenders below could suddenly see the enemy massing at the tree line, preparing to cut through the wire. The problem was simple and lethal. The flare ship could light the battlefield. It could not do the fighting. The Viet Cong adjusted. When flares popped overhead, they froze. They lay flat and waited. They watched the parachutes drift and the magnesium die out. When the C-47 burned through its supply and banked for home, the assault picked back up. Darkness returned. Men died. If you served in Vietnam, or if your father or grandfather did, you know the sound of those radial engines. You know what it meant when Puff showed up overhead. If those engines mean something to you, leave a comment below. We want to hear your story. Captain Ronald W. Terry watched this play out. Not from a headquarters, not from a briefing room, from the open cargo door of a C-47 flare ship orbiting above a Special Forces camp under attack. The wind tore at his flight suit. The flares drifted below on their parachutes, each one a 2 million candle power sun that bleached the jungle white for 60 seconds before dying. In that light, he could see everything. The enemy massing, the wire being cut, the defenders firing from sandbag positions. And then the light died, and there was nothing. Just darkness, and the sound of men dying. Terry was a fighter jock. Not the cerebral kind who studied manuals and wrote papers. The kind who flew by instinct and argued with anyone who told him something could not be done. He had flown F-86 Sabres in the years following Korea and F-100 Super Sabres in the era of supersonic tactical aviation. He was posted to the Aeronautical Systems Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. In early 1964, he deployed on temporary duty to Vietnam as part of an Air Force Systems Command team reviewing air operations and counterinsurgency warfare. He flew observation missions aboard C-47 and C-123 flare ships during nighttime attacks. One night crystallized everything. A hamlet came under attack. The C-47 showed up, released its flares, and lit up the assault in progress. The defenders had clear visibility. Enemy soldiers out in the open, exposed, vulnerable. But the only aircraft overhead was the flare ship. It carried no weapons. It could only observe. The flares died. The C-47 headed home. The hamlet was overrun. Terry returned to Wright-Patterson in mid-1964, carrying a question nobody in the Air Force had solved. What if the light could shoot back? The concept was not original. It had been tested, rejected, and buried 3 separate times across 4 decades. Each time the geometry worked. Each time institutional inertia killed the idea before it could reach a battlefield. In late 1926, First Lieutenant Fred Nelson, a pilot stationed at Brooksfield in San Antonio, Texas, proposed engaging ground targets with automatic weapons mounted perpendicular to the flight path of an aircraft while the pilot flew a continuous bank turn around an imaginary point on the ground. Nelson was not a theorist. He was a pilot who had observed something fundamental about the physics of a banked aircraft. In a steady turn, the lateral axis points consistently at the center of the turn. If you mount a gun perpendicular to the direction of travel, pointing outward from the turning side, that gun will aim continuously at the same point below for as long as the turn is maintained. The pilot does not need to make passes. He does not need to dive. He orbits, and the gun tracks. In 1927, Nelson mounted a .30 caliber machine gun on the left wing of a DH-4 biplane and successfully engaged a ground target while banking. The geometry held. The demonstration was clean, repeatable, and irrefutable. Army leadership watched and dismissed it. No tactical value, too radical. The concept was filed away. 1942. Lieutenant Gilmore C. McDonald proposed installing side-firing weapons on patrol aircraft for anti-submarine work over the Atlantic. The gun would fire downward and to the side, while the aircraft orbited above a surfaced U-boat, maintaining continuous suppressive fire rather than making a single pass. The Navy reviewed the proposal and passed. 1943. McDonald, now a civilian, met Ralph E. Flexman of Bell Aerosystems at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. Flexman grasped immediately what McDonald was describing. A weapons system rejected twice but never disproven. Flexman reached out to Captain John C. Simons at Wright-Patterson. Simons secured approval for a proof-of-concept trial. They labeled it Project Tail Chaser. They fitted cameras on a Convair C-131B cargo aircraft. They scratched crosshairs onto the pilot's left window with a grease pencil. Nothing more sophisticated than a wax mark on glass. That grease pencil mark would change the war. Simons flew pylon turns above a target range at 30 degrees of bank and 120 knots. The cameras captured what the crosshairs tracked. When the film came back, the geometry was flawless. A banking aircraft could hold its left flank aimed at a single spot on the ground continuously for as long as the pilot maintained the turn. The proof was on celluloid. The concept worked in 1927 on a biplane. It worked in 1964 on a transport. The geometry did not care what decade it was. Then the project went cold. Funding dried up. The C-131B, nicknamed Terry and the Pirates after the popular comic strip, sat idle. The test reports went into a filing cabinet at Wright-Patterson. Another burial. Ronald Terry came back from Vietnam and found Project Tail Chaser in that filing cabinet. He read every page. He flew alongside Simons and watched the grease pencil crosshairs track a target while the C-131B banked. He grasped immediately what everyone else had overlooked. This was not theory. Men were dying every night because help could not stay overhead. A flare ship could orbit for hours, but could not engage. A fighter could engage, but could not orbit. Terry had watched both limitations cost lives. He looked at the C-47. Slow, unarmed, able to fly all night. And he pictured it with guns. The C-131B sat in a maintenance hangar at Wright-Patterson under the watch of Master Sergeant Virgil Stanton. Stanton was a career aircraft mechanic who had crewed C-47s in the Pacific during World War II. He had loaded paratroopers at Hollandia, hauled wounded out of Leyte, kept engines running on airstrips that were more mud than concrete. Now approaching his mid-40s and nearing the end of a 30-year career, he maintained the test aircraft that younger officers used for their experiments and then forgot about when the funding stopped. Terry found Stanton in the hangar. The old sergeant looked at the captain and said what he said about every aircraft the brass had written off. She will fly when nothing else will. It was not poetry. It was a maintenance sergeant's professional opinion about a machine he knew from the inside out. Terry would remember that line. It would follow him to Vietnam and beyond. Terry was relentless. He brought in Lieutenant Ralph Kimberlin, project officer for the new General Electric SUU-11A minigun pod. The minigun was a breakthrough in sustained fire technology. Electrically powered 6 rotating barrels, 6,000 rounds per minute. Unlike a gas-operated weapon, which required each cartridge to fire in order to cycle the mechanism, the minigun's electric motor kept the barrels spinning regardless of individual round performance. A dud round did not cause a stoppage. The rotation simply pulled the dud clear, ejected it, and loaded the next live round. The gun kept going. Funding for the test was non-existent. The Air Force had not allocated budget for the side-firing concept. Terry needed ammunition, minigun pods, range-time fuel, and aircraft modification kits. He could not get authorization through normal channels. So he charged expenses to his personal American Express card. A captain in the United States Air Force financing a weapons test that could reshape close air support doctrine with his own credit line. The absurdity of it would become part of the legend. But in the moment, it was simply a man who had watched people die because help could not stay overhead, refusing to let a lack of paperwork prevent the solution. Terry and Kimberlin conducted live fire trials at Eglin Air Force Base in mid-1964. They mounted 3 miniguns inside the C-131B2, firing through modified rear windows, one through the cargo door, all on the left side. The configuration was crude. The guns were bolted to improvised mounts. The ammunition feeds were jury-rigged from helicopter components. The gun sight was borrowed from an A-1 Sky Raider that was scheduled for maintenance and would not miss it for a few days. The entire setup had the handmade quality of a weapons system built by men who were solving the problem themselves because nobody else was going to. They flew pylon turns at 3,000 feet and pulled the trigger. Terry stood at the cargo door and watched the ground erupt. Kimberlin watched the gun camera footage and ran the numbers twice because he did not believe them the first time. At 6,000 rounds per minute per gun, 18,000 rounds combined, the 3 miniguns produced a density of fire that neither man had seen from any weapon system in the inventory. A 3-second burst placed a round in approximately every square yard of an area equivalent to a football field. 1 bullet per square yard in 3 seconds. The ellipse of impact measured roughly 52 yards across. Nothing inside that ellipse survived. Not a man standing, not a man crouching, not a man lying flat. The mathematics of the minigun made hope irrelevant. Every 5th round was a tracer. From below, the tracer stream appeared as a solid red river linking the aircraft to the earth. But that visible stream was only the advertisement. The other 80%, 4 out of every 5 rounds, was the product, invisible and lethal. Terry had proof. He had gun camera footage. He had target impact data. What he did not have was institutional support. Multiple officers in the chain of command had no interest. An old airframe, an unproven concept. Resources better spent elsewhere. In a career-risking move, Captain Terry traveled to Washington and talked his way into a meeting with General Curtis E. LeMay, the Air Force Chief of Staff. LeMay had commanded the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. He had built the Strategic Air Command into the most powerful nuclear strike force in history. He was not a man who suffered fools. Multiple 3-star generals in the room pushed back immediately. Old airframe, no doctrine, no budget. LeMay listened. He had just received reports about enemy successes in breaching air bases in Vietnam. The problem Terry described was not abstract. It was operational and immediate. LeMay's verdict was 6 words. Take them to Vietnam and try it out. The highest endorsement a captain could receive, straight from the Chief of Staff, over the objections of generals who outranked Terry by decades. The project had authorization. The C-47 was selected for operational conversion because special operations units in Vietnam already maintained fleets of them. 3 General Electric SUU-11A miniguns. A gun sight borrowed from an A-1 Sky Raider mounted on the pilot's left window. 24,000 rounds of 7.62mm ammunition. 45 Mark 24 magnesium flares. The aircraft was designated FC-47 fighter cargo. Captain Terry touched down at Bien Hoa Air Base on December 2, 1964. Armed security police met him on the tarmac. They carried instructions from the local command. Send him home. The commander at Bien Hoa had no interest in Terry, his experimental gunship, or any disruption to existing operations. The captain who had risked his career spent his own money and secured authorization from the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force was standing on a runway in Vietnam, being told to get back on the plane. Vice Chief of Staff General John P. McConnell overruled the order from Washington. By December 11, 1964, the first test aircraft was ready. A Douglas C-47 powered by two Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin WASP radial engines producing 1,200 horsepower each. The design dated to the early 1930s. The type's maiden flight had been December 17, 1935, exactly 32 years after the Wright brothers lifted off at Kitty Hawk. Now, 3 decades later, this Depression-era cargo hauler carried 3 electrically driven miniguns capable of combined fire rates no fighter aircraft in the inventory could match. Terry's initial aiming technique was improvised to absurdity. Hold the target between the left propeller hub and the top of the engine cowling, Kentucky windage at 3,000 feet. While Terry and his crew prepared to test the weapon in combat, Sergeant Dale Kowalski was digging a fighting position at a forward outpost in the Mekong Delta. He did not know that the aircraft existed. He did not know that a captain had charged ammunition to his credit card or that a general had overruled a commander on a runway 800 miles north. All Kowalski knew was that every night after sundown, the outpost became a target. The Viet Cong would probe the wire. Some nights they hit it hard. Some nights they passed by. Some nights they watched from the tree line and did nothing, which was almost worse because the watching meant they were counting heads and measuring distances and choosing the night they would come through. The uncertainty was the weapon, not the mortars, not the sappers, the not knowing. You never knew which night would be the one. You never knew if the flare ship would show. You never knew if the jets would be available or already committed somewhere else. The fast jets came and went. The flare ships came and went. Nothing stayed. The darkness filled back in the moment the last flare died like water closing over a stone, and you were alone again with your rifle and your sandbags and the sound of the jungle at night, which was never silent, not really even when nothing was happening. His buddy, a rifleman from Toledo named Eddie, said one night while they were eating cold sea rations in a fighting hole, "You know what I want? I do not want a jet. A jet shows up for 30 seconds and leaves. I do not want a flare ship. A flare ship shows me what is about to kill me, but does not stop it. What I want is something up there that stays. Something that just sits up there all night long and watches. And if they come, it kills them. And if they do not come, it sits there anyway, just in case." Nobody had ever described the AC-47 more accurately, and it had not yet flown its first combat mission. December 15th, 1964. First daytime combat trial. Terry cooperated with a forward air controller and struck sampan structures, trails, and suspected staging areas. The guns performed. On December 21st, FACs directed the gunship onto a building occupied by Viet Cong. The next morning, infantry reported 21 enemy dead in and around the structure. They described the building as a sieve. December 23rd, 1964. Night. The Mekong Delta. A Special Forces outpost at Than Yen was under assault. The request for air support went out at 23:45 hours. The FC-47 showed up 37 minutes later. Inside the aircraft, the crew had never fired the miniguns in actual nighttime combat. Nobody had. This was the first time in history that a side-firing gunship would engage the enemy in darkness. Nobody had considered what the weapons would look, sound, and feel like inside the cargo hold of a C-47 at night. The crew opened fire. One of them recalled it afterward. "We started shooting and it scared me half to death. I thought the guns had exploded. Flames were not just coming from the muzzles, they were blowing back inside the aircraft. Spent brass cascaded across the cargo deck in a copper river. The airframe shuddered from the recoil forces. The gun ports belched fire and smoke into the hold like the throat of a furnace. From below, from the fighting positions at Than Yen, where men had been preparing to die, the tracers appeared as a bending river of red flame dropping from the circling aircraft. The river curved as the plane banked. It poured into the tree line where the assault had been forming. The jungle floor erupted. Trees cracked at the base. Earth fountained upward. The muzzle flashes that had been closing on the wire vanished. Not gradually, all at once, like somebody turned off a switch. The assault on Than Yen collapsed. 4,500 rounds expended. 17 flares released. The outpost survived. Inside, the perimeter defenders, who had been composing farewell messages in their heads, were standing in silence, staring at the sky, listening to the drone of radial engines banking away. Some of them were shaking, not from fear, from relief so sudden and total that the body did not know how to process it. That same night, a second call arrived from Trung Hung 20 miles away. Another nighttime assault on another outpost. The FC-47 diverted, arrived, and opened fire again. The second attack fell apart. Combined ammunition expenditure for the night, 9,000 rounds. 2 outposts saved. In one night, flying 2 separate engagements, the side-firing gunship concept had done more to validate 40 years of rejected proposals than any amount of test footage or briefing slides ever could. Between December 15th and December 26, 1964, the FC-47 flew 16 combat sorties. All 16 succeeded, close to 180,000 rounds fired. Captain Terry flew over 200 combat missions in the AC-47 during his service. He received 2 distinguished flying crosses. He had driven the weapon from concept to combat in under a year, bankrolling early tests with his own credit card, pushing past institutional resistance at every level, demonstrating that a cargo plane designed in the 1930s could become the most feared close air support platform of the Vietnam War. The weapon that turned darkness, the guerrillas' oldest advantage, into a killing ground. February 8, 1965. Bong Son Central Highlands. A single FC-47 loitered above a Viet Cong hilltop position for more than 4 hours. The aircraft poured 20,500 rounds into the fortified site. Ground forces moved in the following morning and tallied approximately 300 enemy dead. 1 aircraft, 1 night, 300. General Joseph Moore, USAF Commander of Air Operations in Vietnam, reviewed the after-action report and immediately requested a full squadron of gunships. The capability was no longer experimental. The FC-47 could remain overhead all night. It could light the battlefield and destroy the enemy simultaneously. Standard combat load, 24,000 rounds. 45 Mark 24 flares. Loiter time, 5 to 7 hours. All night if required. The Dragon had opened its mouth, and every man on the ground who heard that sound, the drone of old radial engines followed by a roar that was not gunfire, but something else entirely, would remember it for the rest of his life. That memory would become the fulcrum of the story. Not the statistics, not the kill counts. The sound. Decades later, veterans would hear a piston-engine aircraft at an air show and stop walking. Their wives would watch their faces change and know not to ask. Kowalski sat against the sandbag wall after the attack and wrote a letter home by flashlight. The paper was damp. The pencil was a stub he had been sharpening with his bayonet for 3 weeks. He wrote, "Dear Ma and Pop, I am fine. We had some trouble last night, but we are okay. Something new showed up. An airplane, but not like any airplane I have ever seen or heard. It sounds like the old radios Pop used to talk about from the war. Same engines. Different war. Same sound. But this one has guns. Not regular guns. Something else. I cannot describe the noise. When it fires, you can see red light coming down from the sky like a river. And then the shooting stops. Not gradually. All at once. I have never been so glad to hear an airplane in my life. I do not know who flies those things. I do not care. I just want them to keep coming back. Tell Pop the sound of those engines is the best sound in the world when somebody is trying to kill you. He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket. He would mail it in the morning if the resupply helicopter came. Outside the Mekong Delta was dark and silent, somewhere overhead fading south, the drone of radial engines. The war went on, but tonight the outpost held. Tonight the dragon came, and the enemy was already learning to fear it. What they called it and what they ordered their soldiers to do about it would be discovered in captured documents that confirmed what every American on the ground already knew. But first, the dragon had to earn its other names, the ones the Americans would give it. And the names would spread across the war zone faster than any official report. Because the men who saw the Red River fall from the sky did not need a report to tell them what they had witnessed. They told each other, and the stories grew, and the legend was born. The designation shifted first. The original FC-47 fighter cargo had produced a roar of indignation from fighter pilots across the theater who refused to accept a lumbering cargo plane as any sort of fighter. These were men who flew supersonic aircraft into AAA and surface-to-air missiles. They had earned the word fighter. They were not sharing it with the transport plane from the 1930s that cruised at 120 knots and shook when the guns fired. To soothe feathers, the designation changed to AC-47, attack cargo. The fighter pilots could keep their pride. The cargo plane would keep saving lives. The American nicknames came fast and stuck forever. During the spring of 1965, Captain Jack Harvey, one of Terry's original flight crew members, flew a night mission to defend a village in the Mekong Delta. A Stars and Stripes reporter happened to witness the action from a ground position below. He watched the tracers stream from the banking aircraft and described the image in his dispatch as dragon's breath amid the roar of the guns echoing from the plane's open door. When the article circulated back to base, the commanding officer of the 1st Air Commando Squadron read the description and said 5 words that would outlive the war itself. Well, I'll be damned. Puff the Magic Dragon. The name came from the popular Peter, Paul, and Mary song. It stuck to the aircraft like paint. Ground troops used it first, then the pilots, then the maintenance crews, then the brass. Puff. The call sign Spooky was adopted by the 4th Air Commando Squadron, activated in August 1965, as the first operational gunship unit because they spent most of their time operating at night in camouflaged aircraft. By the end of 1965, 26 C-47s had been converted to the gunship configuration. The 4th Air Commando Squadron deployed to Tan Son Nhut Air Base on November 14, 1965, with 20 aircraft splitting into 4 detachments across Vietnam's 4 military course areas. Each detachment was responsible for defending outposts and hamlets across its assigned region. The AC-47 became the most requested close air support platform for nighttime defense. When the call went out after dark, the first word on every radio operator's lips was spooky. If your father or grandfather served at any of those outposts, if he ever told you about the sound of spooky overhead, or if the name Puff means something to your family, we would be honored to hear that story. Drop it in the comments. Your memories keep this history alive. The Viet Cong had their own name for the AC-47. What they called it and what they ordered their troops to do about it would be discovered not in intelligence briefings or aerial reconnaissance photographs, but in documents pulled from the bodies and bunkers of enemy soldiers killed or captured in the field. Those documents contained instructions that confirmed what every American on the ground already knew. The Dragon was not just a weapon, it was a psychological event. July 15, 1966. Phu Yen Province. Viet Cong forces struck a Republic of Vietnam outpost after dark. Before the assault began, a guerrilla loudspeaker broadcast to the defenders in Vietnamese. "We are not afraid of your firepower." The message was propaganda. It was theater. It was designed to break the will of men who had been sitting in the dark, waiting for exactly this moment. 4. AC-47s responded simultaneously. 48,800 rounds poured into the assault positions before two F-100 Super Sabres arrived with napalm to finish the engagement. The assault stopped. The loudspeaker was never heard again. October 11, 1966. Quang Phong Province. A single Spooky defended an outpost under sustained assault. The aircraft expended 43,500 rounds. 96 aerial flares released. When the ammunition was exhausted, the crew flew back to base, reloaded the entire aircraft in under 30 minutes, and returned to the fight. Single mission record for rounds expended by an AC-47 gunship. The Vietnamese Air Force 817th Combat Squadron officially adopted the title Fire Dragons. Their pilots averaged 2,000 hours of C-47 flight time before arriving at the squadron. They knew the aircraft the way a farmer knows his land. Every vibration, every sound, every response to wind and weight and weather. Their familiarity with the terrain allowed them to acquire targets faster than their American counterparts, particularly at night. Major Nguyen Son and his Fire Dragon crews would defend outposts and villages across South Vietnam with the same ferocity as the American squadrons, flying the same airframe, carrying the same guns, answering the same calls for help after dark. The captured documents told the rest of the story. Viet Cong standing orders regarding the AC-47 were not superstitious. They were tactical, specific, and blunt. Do not fire at the AC-47. At 3,000 feet, small arms are largely ineffective against the aircraft. Firing at it reveals your position. The Dragon will respond. Better to remain hidden, wait for it to depart, and hope it has not spotted you first. Some documents went further. Do not engage the Dragon, as weapons are futile, and it will only enrage the monster. The enemy's own orders confirmed what the weapon had accomplished. The AC-47 had not simply added firepower to the battlefield. It had changed the psychology of the night. For the first time in the war, the darkness belonged to someone other than the guerrillas. The experience from the other side of that darkness deserves a moment. What it was like to be beneath the Dragon. A Viet Cong cadre leader in a jungle bivouac somewhere in the Delta, hearing the drone of radial engines approach from the south. The order passed by, whispered down the line. Do not move. Do not fire. Do not look up. The tracers descend on a position 300 meters away. The sound falling from the sky is like nothing in his experience, like a factory floor compressed into a single howl and dropped from 3,000 feet. The red stream curves as the aircraft banks. The jungle where the stream touches ceases to exist. Trees crack and fall. Earth erupts. Men who were there a moment ago are not there anymore. Then the aircraft moves on. The cadre leader does not move for 20 minutes after the sound fades. When he finally stands, his legs are shaking.
He has been fighting the Americans for 2 years. He has survived 52 strikes that turned the earth into a moonscape. He has walked through napalmed forest where the trees were still smoking. He has never experienced anything like this. Not the firepower, the precision, the patience. A B-52 passes over. A jet passes over. This thing does not pass over. It circles. It watches. And when it fires, it does not miss. Staff Sergeant Warren Hadley loaded miniguns in the dark. He was from Giles County, Virginia, deep in the New River coal fields, where the mountains swallowed the light by 4 in the afternoon, and the coal dust settled on everything, including hope. His father had gone into the Pocahontas No. 4 mine at 16 and come out at 52 with black lung and a pension that covered the mortgage but not the medication. His mother worked the register at the company store until the store closed. Warren was the middle of 5 children. 2 older brothers went into the mines. Warren enlisted in 1962 because the mine was not going to be his story. He had watched his father cough blood into a handkerchief every morning for as long as he could remember, folding the cloth so the stain would not show, going back underground because there was no other work. Warren took the bus to Roanoke and walked into the recruiter's office and said he would go anywhere that was not underground.
He cross-trained into aerial weapon systems and discovered he had a natural aptitude for the work. The same hands that would have swung a pick in Pocahontas County now field-stripped miniguns in a maintenance hangar at Hurlburt Field. The cargo hold during a firing pass was controlled chaos. The deck vibrated so hard the fillings in his teeth buzzed. The smell was cordite and hydraulic fluid and hot gun barrels spinning at 100 revolutions per second. When all three miniguns fired simultaneously, conversation was impossible. The noise was physical, a pressure against the chest that pushed the air out of your lungs and replaced it with something heavier. Hadley communicated with the other gunners through hand signals and boot kicks. He flew 112 sorties with the 4th Air Commando Squadron. He never saw the enemy he was killing. From 3,000 feet in darkness, the ground was abstract. He saw muzzle flashes below, and then the muzzle flashes stopped. That was how he knew the guns were working. He wrote to his mother once, "Up here, it is noise and brass and the smell of hot metal. Down there, it is the end of the world." I try not to think about it too hard. If I think about it, I think about what the world looks like from the bottom of a coal shaft. And I remember that Pop never thought about it either. He just went to work. But the AC-47 was slow. Top speed 230 miles per hour. Attack speed 120 knots. A World War II airframe in a modern conflict. It operated low 3,000 feet above ground level, within reach of heavy machine guns, mortars, and light anti-aircraft artillery. The aircraft carried no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. A direct hit to the wing or fuselage could mean fire structural failure or both. In late 1965, AC-47s assigned to operate over Laos against the Ho Chi Minh Trail encountered radar-guided 37mm and 57mm anti-aircraft batteries positioned on the ridgelines. The Dragon could not survive that environment. The first aircraft was lost on December 24, 1965. By mid-1966, losses forced the detachment out of Laos entirely. 19 AC-47s were lost during the war, 12 in combat, 86 crew members killed. The legend holds that no outpost defended by an AC-47 ever fell to the enemy. That claim may be accurate, but the aircraft itself could be brought down. And the most devastating loss would happen not over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but at a place called Ashao, where both pilots would fight and die on the ground after the Dragon was shot from the sky. March 9, 1966. The Ashao Valley. A mile-wide valley in the mountains near the Laotian border, about 50 miles northwest of Da Nang. The Special Forces camp there was positioned to monitor North Vietnamese infiltration routes. On that morning, approximately 2,000 NVA regulars launched a full-scale assault. The camp's defenders, 17 American Special Forces troops, and 375 South Vietnamese soldiers, were surrounded and forced to retreat to a bunker at the northeast corner of the outpost. Air support was desperately needed. Rescue would be nearly impossible. A 400-foot cloud ceiling pressed aircraft below the level of the surrounding mountaintops. Steady rain of mortar rocket and automatic weapons fire tore up the landing strip and pinned the defenders in their bunker. They were in imminent danger of being overrun. At 11:20, Captain Willard M. Collins and his AC-47 crew were roused from their beds at Da Nang. They had flown a mission the previous night. Collins was from Quincy, Illinois. His co-pilot was First Lieutenant Delbert R. Peterson, 26 years old, from Manson, Iowa, a small town in Calhoun County. Peterson had graduated from Iowa State University in 1962 with a degree in mechanical engineering. He was the eldest of 7 children. Staff Sergeant Robert E. Foster from Lockport, New York, manned the guns. 3 additional crew members completed the 6-man team. She will fly when nothing else will. The AC-47 was never designed for what Collins was about to ask it to do. It was designed to orbit at 3,000 feet above flat terrain in relatively permissive airspace. Collins was going to fly it below a 400-foot cloud ceiling into a mile-wide valley surrounded by mountains and 2,000 enemy soldiers with heavy weapons. Every other aircraft sent to support a Shao had been turned back by the weather or the terrain or the fire. Nothing else could get in. Collins and Peterson made 2 unsuccessful attempts to get under the clouds and into the valley. Each time the cloud base pushed them back or the mountains closed in before they could find an opening. On the 3rd attempt flying at treetop height through a gap in the ridgeline, they found their way in. Below the camp was in chaos. Smoke from burning structures mixed with fog. Muzzle flashes sparkled across the valley floor. The NVA had broken through the outer wire and were pushing toward the bunker complex. Collins located the outpost and began a firing pass on the NVA positions in the open. The miniguns tore into the assault formations. The besiegers had not expected the Dragon in those conditions at that altitude and weather that had grounded everything else. For a brief moment, the attack wavered. But at 400 feet, the AC-47 was not a gunship. It was a target, within range of every weapon the NVA had on the ground. The vulnerable airframe, no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and airliner from the 1930s absorbed hits from small arms and heavy machine guns as it lumbered through the narrow valley. On the second pass, coordinated .50 caliber machine gun fire from multiple positions struck the aircraft. The right engine was hit hard and torn from its mounts. The propeller windmilled in the slipstream, dragging the aircraft into a yaw that Collins fought with every ounce of rudder authority the C-47 possessed. He had barely regained control when the left engine was knocked out. Both engines gone. The AC-47 was now a 30,000-pound glider in a mile-wide valley surrounded by mountains descending through a ceiling that had already turned away every other aircraft sent to help. With extraordinary airmanship, Collins and Peterson brought the bullet-riddled gunship down for a crash landing on a mountain slope. The tail section broke on impact. The left wing crumpled against a tree. The fuselage slid across the muddy ground and came to rest canted at an angle. All crew members survived the crash except Foster, whose legs were broken by the impact. He was in agony, unable to move, trapped in the wreckage of an aircraft that was now a stationary target on a mountainside within earshot of 2,000 NVA regulars, who had just watched the Dragon fall from the sky. Collins and Peterson faced an immediate decision. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Foster could not be moved. If they left him and moved to more defensible terrain, they improved their own chances of survival and extraction. If they stayed, they were defending a fixed position with no cover, no heavy weapons, and no prospect of reinforcement until a helicopter could find them in the clouds. They stayed. They did not discuss it. They set up a defensive perimeter around the crash site around their injured gunner and prepared to fight. The men who had been flying the Dragon were now on the ground armed with sidearms and an M16 surrounded by the same enemy they had been strafing from 3,000 feet. The asymmetry was total. In the air, they were invincible. On the ground, they were 6 wounded men with small arms against a regiment. The enemy hit the crash site within 15 minutes. Collins, Peterson, and the surviving crew repulsed the first assault with concentrated fire. The NVA pulled back, regrouped, and came again. A second attack followed minutes later, heavier, more organized. During the firefight, Collins and Foster were killed. With only 4 men left to defend a 360-degree perimeter, the chance of holding out looked bleak. Then Peterson, now in command, heard the distinctive sound of a USAF HH-43 rescue helicopter approaching through the clouds. The helicopter was their only chance. But muzzle flashes from a heavy machine gun that had been moved to within yards of the wrecked AC-47 were clearly visible. The NVA had positioned the gun to cover the only clearing large enough for a helicopter to land. If that gun was not silenced, the helicopter would be shot down the moment it dropped below the cloud ceiling. Peterson charged the machine gun position. He sprayed fire from his M16 rifle as he ran across open ground toward the muzzle flashes. The hostile fire diminished. The helicopter dropped in and extracted 3 surviving crew members. Peterson was not among them. When last seen alive, he was crawling behind the wreckage of the AC-47 wounded, still shooting, covering the extraction of his crew. His body was never recovered. His family waited 12 years before the government changed his status from missing in action to killed in action in February 1978. In the mid-1990s, villagers near the crash site found Peterson's identification tag, a chain, and a key. Excavations revealed a military identification card and a religious medal. No remains. The mountains of the A-Show Valley kept him. Both Captain Willard M. Collins and First Lieutenant Delbert R. Peterson received the Air Force Cross posthumously. It was the only instance in Air Force history where both pilots of a single aircraft received the nation's second highest decoration for valor. It was the only Air Force Cross ever awarded for extraordinary heroism in both air and ground combat. The Dragon could be killed. It took 2,000 men and the deaths of 3 crew members to bring one down. Even then, the crew fought to the end on the ground. The enemy had destroyed the machine. They had not destroyed the spirit of the men inside it. The A-Show loss did not stop the program. The Air Force adapted. They restricted AC-47 operations over heavily defended areas. They kept the gunships where they were most effective, defending outposts and hamlets and bases in the lowlands, and the Delta where the ceiling was high enough to orbit at 3,000 feet, and the anti-aircraft threat was manageable. The Dragon had limits, but within those limits, it remained supreme. By 1968, the force had grown to 53 aircraft across 3 squadrons. During 1967 alone, the gunships flew 1,596 sorties, with an estimated 3,650 Viet Cong killed. At the Battle of Khe Sanh in early 1968, President Lyndon Johnson demanded the Marine base be held at all costs. More than 24,000 tactical and 2,700 B-52 strikes dropped 110,000 tons of ordnance over 2.5 months, averaging over 300 sorties per day. But at night, when the B-52s could not distinguish friend from foe, and the fast movers could not find the wire, Spooky owned the battlefield. A C-47 gunships circled the besieged base for hours, dropping flares to turn the perimeter into a lit killing ground, hosing down NVA troops who tried to creep up to the wire under cover of darkness. Night after night, for 2.5 months, the Dragon kept the darkness at bay. The Marines held Khe Sanh. The Dragon was a significant reason why. By 1968, the AC-47 had defended more than 4,000 outposts and bases. The crews maintained their proud claim, and they would carry it for the rest of their lives. No post defended by one of their planes had ever fallen. Meanwhile, Major Terry, now promoted and developing the next generation, returned to Vietnam in September 1967 to test Project Gunship 2, the gunship variant of the Lockheed C-130 Hercules. The AC-130 would carry heavier weapons, fly higher, absorb more damage, and survive in environments that killed the AC-47. The son was about to inherit from the father. The pylon turn that Fred Nelson demonstrated in 1927, the geometry that Simons confirmed with grease pencil crosshairs, the concept that Terry proved in combat over the Mekong Delta would now scale upward to platforms carrying 20mm cannons, 40mm Bofors guns, and eventually a 105mm howitzer firing from inside an aircraft. But the AC-47 was not finished. Not yet. It had one more story to tell, and that story would not be about the weapon. It would be about a man, a 23-year-old loadmaster from Hartford, Connecticut, an airman first class, one of the lowest enlisted ranks in the United States Air Force, a quiet kid from Glastonbury who had wanted to join the Navy and ended up loading flares on a gunship over the Mekong Delta. His name was John Lee Levitow, and on the night of February 24th, 1969, a mortar round a burning flare, thousands of rounds of live ammunition, and 20 seconds would make his name immortal. John Lee Levitow was born on November 1st, 1945 in Hartford, Connecticut, to a Jewish family. He grew up in Glastonbury, a quiet town along the Connecticut River, where the elms arched over Main Street and the seasons turned without urgency. He attended Glastonbury High School. He was not a remarkable student. He was not a remarkable athlete. He did not lead clubs or win awards or give speeches at assemblies. He was the kind of young man who disappears into the middle rows of a yearbook photograph and is remembered by his classmates, if at all, as quiet, dependable, and present. The kind of kid who shows up on time, does what is asked, and never makes a fuss about any of it. The kind of kid that a teacher might describe if pressed as solid. He originally intended to join the Navy. Something changed his mind. He never elaborated on what or why, and nobody pressed him for an explanation because that was not the kind of person John Levittow was. He did not explain himself. He made decisions and moved forward. In June 1966, at the age of 20, he enlisted in the United States Air Force. His first career field assignment was civil engineering. He built things, repaired things, poured concrete, and ran electrical conduit on military installations. The work was steady and unglamorous, and exactly the kind of assignment that a quiet kid from Glastonbury would accept without complaint. There was no crisis of purpose, no moment of transformation. He did the work and waited for whatever came next. What came next was a cross-training opportunity into the loadmaster career field. A loadmaster manages cargo during flight. He calculates weight and balance. He secures equipment. He handles anything that goes in or out of the aircraft. On a C-130 or a C-141, the job is logistics. On an AC-47 gunship, the job is logistics. Performed inside a cargo hold filled with stacked cans of live ammunition. 3 miniguns firing 100 rounds per second, spent brass cascading across the deck in a copper river, and Mark 24 magnesium flares that burn at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The loadmaster on a spooky mission is part cargo handler, part ammunition bearer, part ordnance technician, and part the last line of safety between a functioning aircraft and a catastrophic internal fire. The margin for error is measured in seconds. The consequences of failure are measured in lives. Levittow accepted the assignment without apparent hesitation. He deployed to Vietnam. He flew missions with the 3rd Special Operations Squadron. He loaded flares. He cleared stoppages. He kicked brass out of the walkway so nobody tripped, and went out the open cargo door at 3,000 feet. He did his job quietly and without distinction, the same way he had done everything else in his life. By February 1969, he had completed 180 combat sorties without incident. He had never been wounded. He had never been recognized for anything beyond competent service. He was 23 years old and an airman first class. 180 missions, 180 takeoffs, and 180 landings, and 180 nights of noise and brass, and the smell of cordite and the sight of tracers falling into the dark. Routine, the most dangerous word in a war zone. February 24th, 1969. Evening, Bien Hoa Air Base. Levittow was asked to fill in for the regular loadmaster on Spooky 71 and AC-47D gunship with serial number 434977. Oh, his 181st combat sortie. A routine substitution, the kind of thing that happens in a war zone every day. The regular man was sick or on leave or assigned elsewhere. Levittow took the slot. He checked his equipment. He inspected the flares. He verified the ammunition count. He did what loadmasters do. The 8-man crew lifted off into a clear night sky. Major Kenneth Carpenter at the controls. Navigator William Platt at his station. Airmen, First Class LSC, Owen on the guns. Sergeant Edward Fusey and the remainder of the crew in the cargo compartment. The Goonie Bird climbed into the dark over Bien Hoa banked south and headed for its patrol station. Below, the lights of Saigon spread across the Mekong floodplain. From altitude, Vietnam at night looked like any other country with too many fires burning. Spooky 71 had been airborne for 4.5 hours patrolling the Saigon area without incident when Major Carpenter spotted muzzle flashes outside Long Binh Army Post, the massive logistics base a few miles northeast of the capital. Long Binh was under mortar attack from NVA forces. Carpenter threw the AC-47 into a banked turn to engage. The miniguns opened up. 3,000 rounds poured into the enemy positions in 2 quick firing passes. The attack slowed. The aircraft received an urgent request to remain in the area and provide sustained illumination for friendly ground forces engaged in combat. Carpenter agreed. Spooky 71 settled into its orbit, banking left, circling above the tracers and the flashes, the engines droning, the flares drifting down like slow-motion suns. In the cargo compartment, Levital worked through the routine he had performed 180 times before. Set the ejection timer. Set the ignition timer. Hand the flare to Owen. Owen gripped the 3-foot metal tube, 27 pounds of magnesium and ignition compound, with his finger through the pull ring attached to the safety pin. On the pilot's command, Owen would simultaneously pull the pin and toss the flare through the open cargo door. The flare would fall, the parachute would deploy, and 2 million candle power of magnesium light would turn the battlefield below into noon. A second call came in requesting illumination 2 miles south of Long Bin. Carpenter swung the aircraft south. The pilots could see flashes from a heavy mortar barrage ahead. Levito set the timer on a Mark 24 flare and handed it to Owen. Owen gripped it, finger through the pull ring. Ready. Every once in a while, Levito recalled later, you would hear a muffled noise when a mortar hit. You could hear the engines on the aircraft, the noise of the guns firing, and the pilot giving instructions. It was loud, but it was routine. You got used to the noise. You got used to everything. That was the danger. You stopped expecting the thing that would change everything. An NVA 82mm mortar round struck the right wing of Spooky 71 and detonated inside the wing structure. The blast punched a hole 2 feet in diameter through the aluminum skin. Fragments from the explosion tore through the fuselage in every direction, creating more than 3,500 shrapnel holes in the wings and body of the aircraft. Every man in the cargo compartment was wounded and slammed against the floor and fuselage walls by the concussion. The aircraft lurched into a steep descending turn to the right, momentarily out of control. Navigator William Platt said afterward, the aircraft was lit up like daylight by the flash of the explosion. Sergeant Edward Fusey, wounded by shrapnel, watched 3 men knocked over by the impact, one covered in blood. The armed flare was ripped from Owen's hands. When it left his grip, his finger pulled the safety pin free. The fuse activated. The smoking flare tumbled loose onto the cargo deck. It rolled wildly across the tilting floor, bouncing off ammunition cans, spinning through spent brass and debris. Surrounding it on both sides of the aisle, stacked ammunition cans holding 19,000 rounds of live 7.62 millimeters. In fewer than 20 seconds, the Mark 24 flare would ignite at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It would burn through the aluminum floor of the aircraft. It could detonate the ammunition stores. It would kill the aircraft and every man inside it. 20 seconds. The length of time it takes to tie a shoe. The length of time it takes to walk from your kitchen to your front door. In that time, the flare would reach ignition temperature and 8 men would die in a fireball over Long Bin. The cargo compartment was dark, except for the orange glow of the smoking flare and the instrument lights bleeding through the cockpit doorway. Smoke from the explosion mixed with the cordite residue that already filled the hold. The aircraft was banking hard to the right, descending partially out of control. Carpenter was fighting to maintain altitude with a 2-foot hole in his wing and 3,500 punctures in his fuselage. John Levito was carrying over 40 shrapnel wounds in his back and legs. He had partial loss of sensation in his right leg. He was bleeding from wounds he could not see and could not count. He described the blast later as feeling like getting hit by a 2x4. He was not thinking about the Medal of Honor. He was not thinking about heroism. He was not thinking about anything except the flare and the ammo cans, and the 20 seconds, and the 8 men who would die if he did not move. He hauled himself upright. The deck was tilted at an angle that made standing nearly impossible. First, he turned to the crew member nearest to him, a man bleeding heavily and perilously close to the open cargo door. The man had been thrown there by the blast and was half hanging out of the aircraft. Levito grabbed him by the harness and dragged him forward away from the door toward the center of the cabin. The effort cost him. His right leg was not responding properly. His back was on fire. Blood from his own wounds was making the floor slick under his hands and knees. Then he saw the flare. It was rolling wildly through the aisle, propelled by the steep bank angle, bouncing off ammunition cans spinning, smoking. The fuse was ticking down. Levito started toward it. The deck was tilted. The aircraft was shuddering. The flare rolled away from him as the bank angle shifted. He crawled after it on his hands and the knee that still worked. He reached for it, and the aircraft lurched and the flare skittered sideways toward the stacked ammo cans. He crawled after it again. He could not get a grip on the smooth metal cylinder. His fingers were slick with blood. His hands were not responding to what his brain was telling them to do. He threw himself bodily onto the flare. He wrapped the burning device against his chest with both arms. The canister was warm against his body. The fuse was active. He could feel the chemical process accelerating inside the tube, the heat building the ignition compound approaching the point of no return. In seconds, the magnesium would catch. 4,000 degrees against his flight suit, against his chest, against the skin and bone of a 23-year-old loadmaster from Glastonbury, Connecticut. The same physics that made the pylon turn worked the same principle that aimed the guns at the ground was now rolling a live flare toward the ammunition stores. The geometry that had saved thousands of lives at thousands of outposts was trying to kill the crew of Spooky 71. The bank angle fought Levito the way gravity fights a man climbing a hill made of ice. Every time he gained an inch, the tilt of the aircraft tried to roll him back toward the ammo cans. He was leaving a blood trail on the aluminum deck. He did not know this. He knew only that the flare was against his chest, and the door was behind him, and the ammunition was ahead of him, and he needed to reverse that equation before the magnesium caught. Levito dragged himself toward the rear of the aircraft. The bank angle was fighting him. The plane was perforated, barely answering the controls. Spent brass and debris covered the deck. Every inch of progress cost him effort that his wounded body could barely produce. He reached the cargo door. He heaved the flare out into the darkness. It ignited the instant it cleared the aircraft. A magnesium sun, 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, blooming in the night sky below Spooky 71. If Levito had been 1 second slower, the flare would have ignited inside the cargo hold. The ammunition would have detonated. 8 men would have died in a fireball over Long Bin. 1 second. The difference between a catastrophe and a miracle measured in the time it takes a human heart to beat once. Major Carpenter regained control of the crippled aircraft. He brought Spooky 71 down at Bien Hoa. When the ground crew saw the aircraft in daylight the next morning, they counted more than 3,500 holes. The right wing had a gaping wound. Several windows were shattered. That the aircraft flew at all was a testament to the Douglas engineers who had designed it in the 1930s and to the pilot who refused to let it fall. Every crew member survived. If this story moved you, if you believe this kind of courage deserves to be remembered, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have a connection to the AC-47, to Spooky, to Puff the Magic Dragon, we want to hear from you. Levito was evacuated for treatment. He spent 2.5 months in a hospital recovering from 40-plus shrapnel wounds. He could have gone home. He had earned it. Nobody would have questioned a medical discharge or a stateside reassignment. He had 181 missions. He had the wounds to prove it. He had done more than enough. He went back to Vietnam. He flew 20 more combat sorties. May 14, 1970. Armed Forces Day. The White House. President Richard M. Nixon presented Sergeant John Lee Levito with the Medal of Honor. He had been promoted from Airman First Class to Sergeant in the months following the incident, but at the time of his actions, he had held one of the most junior enlisted ranks in the military. He became the first enlisted member of the United States Air Force to receive the Medal of Honor. The ceremony was held in the Rose Garden. Levito stood at attention while the president read the citation. He was 24 years old. He was wearing his dress blues. Behind the president, Captain James P. Fleming, another Air Force Medal of Honor recipient, stood at attention. The cameras clicked. The reporters wrote their stories. The moment was captured and filed. But the citation could not capture what unfolded in those seconds on the cargo deck of Spooky 71. No words on paper could. The geometry of it, the steep bank, the loose flare, the countdown, the ammunition, the choice to grab the burning device instead of diving clear through the open door. It was not recklessness. Recklessness implies a disregard for consequences. Levitou understood the consequences precisely. He understood that the flare would ignite. He understood that the ammunition would detonate. He understood that 8 men would die. He understood that grabbing the flare meant the fire would burn him first. He grabbed it anyway, because the alternative was worse. It was the same logic that had created the weapon itself, a problem unsolvable until somebody solved it. Fred Nelson looked at a banking aircraft in 1927 and saw a weapons platform. Terry looked at a flare ship in 1964 and saw a gunship. Levitou looked at a burning flare rolling toward the ammunition stores and saw 20 seconds to save 8 lives. The common thread was not courage, it was clarity, seeing the problem, seeing the solution, acting before the window closed. Levitou left the Air Force as a sergeant in 1974. He was 28 years old. He had the Medal of Honor. He had a name that every enlisted airman in professional military education would learn. And he had the quiet, unassuming temperament that had defined him before the war and would define him after it. He did not seek celebrity. He did not capitalize on his fame. He did not write a book or go on a speaking tour. He married Barbara Ann Corbeil at St. Augustine's Church in Glastonbury in July 1969. They had 2 children. He went to work. He spent the next 22 years in Veterans Affairs. He served as a congressional liaison for the federal VA in Connecticut, navigating the bureaucratic machinery on behalf of veterans who needed help and did not know how to ask for it. He was chief of medical administration for the Newington Fife VA Medical Center, overseeing the care of veterans whose wounds had followed them home from Southeast Asia. He joined the Connecticut Department of Veterans Affairs as Director of Planning and advanced to Senior Assistant to the Commissioner. The quiet kid from Glastonbury spent the second half of his life making sure other veterans did not disappear into the cracks of a system that owed them everything. That was the second act of heroism in John Levitou's life. The first took 20 seconds on a cargo deck. The second took 22 years behind a desk. Both required the same thing: the willingness to do the work that nobody else was going to do. Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force Jim Finch said this when John Levitou passed away on November 8, 2000 at his home in Connecticut after a long battle with cancer. He was 55 years old. John Levitou for years has been woven into the fabric of enlisted heritage. Through his heroic efforts, he was the embodiment of our core value: service before self. His name has become synonymous with excellence, and his legacy will continue to live in the hearts and minds of all Air Force members today and well into the future. The John Levitou Award is the highest honor presented to the top graduate of every Air Force enlisted professional military education course. More than 19,000 future senior NCOs have received it. On January 31, 1998, a Boeing C-17 Globemaster 3 serial number 960005 was christened the Spirit of Sergeant John L. Levitou. At the ceremony, Levitou said something that captured who he was more completely than any citation ever could. "I am a firm believer that I do represent the enlisted corps. Sometimes they do go unrecognized, and they do feel that way. I hope it is a strong aircraft and lasts as long as that AC-47 gunship I was on February 24, 1969. That airplane was 22 years older than I was at the time of the incident. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery." Section 66. Site 7107. The AC-47 flew its final American combat sortie in December 1969. It had validated the concept beyond any doubt and given birth to an entire category of weapon. Every gunship that came after descended directly from it. A C-119G Shadow, a C-119K Stinger, a C-130, A. Spectre first deployed in 1968 carrying 20mm Vulcan cannons, 40mm Bofors guns, and eventually a 105mm howitzer, a field artillery piece firing from inside an aircraft. The lineage continued through the AC-130H, the AC-130U Spooky II, the AC-130W Stinger II. Each generation more heavily armed, more survivable, more technologically advanced. Each generation built on the same principle. Today, the AC-130J Ghost Rider serves with Air Force Special Operations Command. First combat deployment June 2019. It carries a 30mm automatic cannon, a 105mm howitzer Griffin missiles, and GPS-guided bombs. The aircraft weighs 70 tons. It can engage targets from altitudes the AC-47 could never reach with precision that Captain Terry's Kentucky windage could never achieve. But the foundational maneuver remains the same. 30 degrees of bank. Guns on the left flank. Continuous aim on a fixed point below. The geometry Fred Nelson demonstrated in 1927 on a DH-4 biplane at Brooks Field in Texas still holds on a 70-ton turboprop gunship carrying precision-guided munitions. Nearly a century of aviation technology has changed everything about the platform. It has changed nothing about the principle. The grease pencil crosshairs that Simon scratched onto the window of a C-131B at Wright-Patterson are the ancestors of the digital fire control displays on the AC-130J. The turn is the same. The geometry holds. The Spooky Brotherhood, the AC-47 Gunship Association, holds reunions every September. Over 100 air commandos attended the memorial dedication at Hurlburt Field Air Park on September 9, 2016. The plaque lists all 86 fallen crew members by name. Collins, Peterson, Foster, and 83 others. At one of those reunions years before age and distance began to thin the ranks, Master Sergeant Virgil Stanton sat in a folding chair under a tent at the edge of the flight line. He had retired in 1970 with 30 years of service. He had never flown a combat mission. He had never been to Vietnam. He was a maintenance man. He kept the aircraft flying. He kept a list in a small notebook of every tail number he had serviced and the names of the crew who did not come back. 86 names. He could recite them from memory. A younger man asked Stanton what he remembered most about the AC-47 program. Stanton thought about it. He looked at the static display aircraft on the ramp and said what he had always said what he had said to Terry in the hangar at Wright-Patterson all those years ago. What he had said about every aircraft the brass had written off. I remember every time they told us she could not do the job. Too slow, too old, too vulnerable, and every time she flew anyway. She flew when nothing else would. One veteran wrote this decades after the war. She had been a service club girl with the 3rd Brigade 101st Airborne Division at Phu Bai in 1968. A service club girl ran the recreation center on base. She served coffee and played cards with soldiers and wrote letters home for men whose hands shook too badly to hold a pen. She was not a combatant. On most nights, she poured coffee and talked about baseball and tried not to think about the sound of mortars hitting the perimeter. On one night, the perimeter did not hold. She wrote, "One night Charlie was coming through the motor pool and about to overrun us. It was dire enough that I was given a pistol. I had never fired a pistol in my life. I did not know if I could fire one at a man. Then Puff showed up. It was the most beautiful sight I have ever seen. All those red tracers in the night. I dearly love all you spooky guys, even though we never knew who you were. Thank you. Thank you." The commemorative Air Force Gulf Coast Wing operates the only confirmed flyable AC-47 today. Serial number 4349297, painted in 4th Special Operations Squadron markings. Tail code EN086. The 086 honors the 86 men who did not come home. Dale Kowalski. The Polish kid from Hamtramck, who heard the dragon for the first time on a dark night in the Mekong Delta, went home in 1967. He took a job at the Chrysler plant in Sterling Heights, working the bodyline fitting door panels onto sedans and station wagons. It was honest work, good union pay. He married Helen from St. Florian Parish, who made pierogi on Fridays and did not ask about Vietnam. He raised 2 sons. He coached their little league teams. He went to Mass on Sundays and the VFW Hall on Saturdays, and he never talked about the war. He never talked about it because there was nothing to say that anyone would understand. How do you describe the sound of salvation to someone who has never been minutes from death? How do you explain that the most beautiful thing you have ever heard is the drone of piston engines from a machine designed before your parents were born? You do not explain it. You fold it up and put it in the same place where your father put the things he could not talk about, from the Ford plant, the accidents, the burns, the day the press took Stasek Dombrowski's hand, and you go on living. You go on because that is what working men do. They do not talk about the worst day. They show up for the next one, except once. At an air show in 2004, in the flat Michigan sunlight of a September afternoon, an aircraft rumbled overhead and Dale Kowalski stopped walking. His grandson, 9 years old, holding a dripping snow cone, was pulling at his sleeve. But Kowalski was not there. He was 22 again, and the night was pressing in, and the wire was being cut, and someone was screaming on the radio, and then he heard the engines. Twin Pratt and Whitney R1830 radials. The same sound. The same low rhythmic drone that had preceded the roar on the worst nights of his life, and the best. The drone that meant someone was coming.
The drone that meant the darkness would break. He stood very still in the Michigan sun, with tears on a face that had not cried since 1967.
His grandson pulled at his sleeve. "Grandpa, what is it? What is wrong?"
Kowalski knelt down next to his grandson. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder. The AC-47 was banking overhead the afternoon light, catching the aluminum fuselage. The tail code EN086, visible for a moment before the aircraft straightened and climbed south over the Michigan farmland. He said, "That is the most beautiful thing you will ever hear. And I want you to remember it because the men who flew that airplane are the reason your grandfather came home." The boy looked up at the disappearing aircraft. He did not understand. He was 9. He would understand later when he was old enough to read the names on the plaque, when he was old enough to know what 86 meant, when he was old enough to hear the engines himself and feel what his grandfather felt. For now, it was enough that his grandfather was kneeling beside him in the Michigan sun, alive, with his hand on his shoulder, because of a sound that came from the sky on a dark night 40 years ago. Somewhere in Connecticut, John Levitow rests at Arlington. Section 66, Site 7107. The quiet kid from Glastonbury, who threw himself onto a burning flare and then spent 22 years making sure other veterans were not forgotten. Somewhere in Ohio, in a filing cabinet that may or may not still exist at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the original Project Tailchaser reports gather dust. The grease pencil crosshairs that Captain John Simon scratched onto the window of a C-131B in 1964 are gone, wiped away by time and cleaning fluid. But the geometry they proved is flying tonight. Somewhere over a desert or a mountain range or a jungle, in an AC-130J Ghost Rider that carries more firepower than an entire squadron of AC-47s. The turn is the same. 30 degrees a bank, guns on the left flank, a fixed point below. 86 men flew into the night and never came home, but no outpost they guarded ever fell. The geometry holds. The dragon keeps its word.